Today on the Perception and Action podcast, a look at a recent study that provides evidence that cricket bowlers use movement variability as opposed to movement repeatability to regulate the timing and speed of the delivery. And a review of a classic paper in ecological dynamics, the first study to show this effect. So it's time for a call to action. Hi, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Now on to the show. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception Action podcast, back with another article review. In this episode, what I want to do is talk about a new paper that looks at functional variability in cricket bowling. And this, of course, is a hallmark of the ecological approach, the idea that the way that we achieve consistency in outcomes, whether we're talking about accuracy or speed or whatever the desired goal is not through repeatability of motion, right? We don't achieve a repeatable outcome by repeatable movement. We achieve a repeatable outcome by having functional variability in the movement. That is, we vary our movement from trial to trial, depending on the constraints we're faced with, from execution to execution, in order to maintain our outcome consistency, right? That's a fundamental idea of a Bernstein's repetition without repetition. So this is another study that kind of looks at this, right? Here's the paper by Andrews et al., an interesting study. What this allows me to do, before I get into their study, this allows me to talk a little bit about one of the most, what I would say is one of the most important papers in ecological dynamics that builds on, it wasn't called that when this paper came out, but it's one of the classic papers that I think everyone should read. If you want a reading list, I would put this one on. It's Timing and Attacking Forehand Drive in Table Tennis by Reinau Bootsma, a very influential person in ecological psychology and a thinker. As I said, this is a really classic paper. And they were really the first ones to demonstrate evidence of this functional variability. And what they looked at a bunch of forehand shots in table tennis, ping pong for those of us in North America. So they're having people hit a target on the other side of the table. They measured various aspects of the movement. Right, but this is kind of the most essential finding they had was they looked at the direction, orientation of the paddle when the movement started, when they started the forehand stroke versus when they hit the ball. And what they found was that at the initial initiation of the movement, there was a huge variation. There's huge variability from stroke to stroke. But at the point of contact, because they were hitting it to the same location, the variability was low. So somehow between the initiation of the movement and the end of the movement, the variability was reduced, which is what we expect in perspective control, right? Your online control of the movement. It's not what you would expect if you're using a pre-planned, programmed movement of a motor programmed of a forehand, right? You can't have something, if it's purely planned and you're just running off a motor program, it can't reduce in variability from the start to the end, right? If anything, variability would go up, right? They've consistently found this effect. Sometimes this is called the funnel of variability. Variability starts large at the start of a movement and goes to small when it really matters, right? And I've kind of highlighted this various times over the years in the podcast episode, this funnel of variability, right? And kind of in my book, I doubt the start of movements don't really matter, right? You don't need to be accurate when you start your movement. You need to be accurate at the critical points when you contact the ball, right? So having variability. And also, this variability raises the possibility it's functional, right? It wasn't demonstrated in this paper that this variation at the start of the movement might be related to the constraints or other things like that, right? So everyone, I would recommend you give that paper a read. It's Timing and Attacking Forehand Drive in Table Tennis. There's a link in the show notes. It's a really classic paper in this field. But in this study, what they're looking at is cricket bowling. So they're looking at cricket bowling, fast bowling, right? So they're doing long. Cricket bowlers, as most people know, cricket lasts a long time, and you have to maintain your delivery, the velocity and the accuracy, right? In order to do that, right, and classic ecological, the constraints are changing amongst other things: the batter, the ground surface, your level of fatigue, your muscle. So you can't do the same movement over and over and maintain this consistency, right? And so what they do, they talk about how bowling can divide into 3 stages: the run up, the bound, and the delivery, right? Which can be defined by particular landmarks: your back foot making contact with the ground, your front foot making contact with the ground, and the ball release, right? And what they want to do is look at the variability and timing between these 3 phases of the delivery: front foot, back foot contact, and ball release, to see if they get the classic Bootsma and Van Weergen effect of the funnel of variability, right? So the purpose of the study was to determine whether movement variability is contributing to performance outcome. Is it functional in the delivery, right, for maintaining delivery speed? So that's what the goal. They're making two predictions. The first one is that if you look at the variability in the speed, so what they're going to do is measure the variability and outcome across several bowls, several throws, pitches, whatever, of these bowlers. They're going to they measure the variability in the outcome, the variability in speed, compared to the variability in movement, in particular at the start of the movement, right? And if you're pre-programming movements, those should be the same, right? You can't have consistent speeds if you have inconsistent deliveries, right? If you're pre-programming. But of course, this is one of Bernstein's classic findings. So Bernstein's classic finding with the hammer and the blacksmith, what he found was, if you look at the variability in the hammer, the effector, the thing you're affecting, just like the ball speed, right? It's way lower than the variability in the body movements, right? That's one of his classic findings, right? So something must be going on, some magic, functional variability between those 2 things, right? And the second thing they expected to find was the Bootsma finding, that the funnel of variability. If you look at the variability later in the movement, it should be lower than variability earlier in the movement. So kind of a fairly straightforward study trying to find support for this in cricket bowling. So they took 92 fast bowlers who were members of a state development program. They had a standardized bowling test in which they did 18 deliveries. I think they only used the first 6 in the analysis because there was so much data. Right. So after a warm up, they're bowling at their highest speed. There's a batsman in there. They're in a netted environment and they're making these deliveries. Okay. They looked at the inter-individual variability of the movement. So for across your deliveries, how much your time of back foot contact between back foot front contact and front foot contact and ball release. They looked at these for each individual. They used a measure called the coefficient of variation, which is another measure of variability like standard deviation or standard error. And they took these, that's how they calculated it, and they expressed it in percentages. So it's fairly, again, straightforward, trying to find this funnel of variability effect. And here's what they find. So if you look at, for example, there's both a figure and a table here. You can see that these are all the individuals. There's much more variability early in the delivery between the back foot front contact and the front foot contact, and then there is at the front foot contact and ball release, and then there's much in ball speed. In terms of numbers, the variability early in the delivery from back foot contact to front foot contact, the coefficient vary was 4.7. As you get from closer to delivery, it goes down to 2.5, and the delivery speed is 2.2. And measured as a percentage. So what they're finding here again is evidence that variability is being reduced along the way during the execution, which, as I said, can only happen if you're somehow regulating your movement online, right? If it's pre-programmed through a motor program, that's not possible, right? So again, providing evidence for this. So greater variability in stride was earlier in the delivery versus later in the delivery. They looked at a bunch of other variables like the length. Most people, if you know cricket, the length you bowl the ball is very important. There was no variation in that could explain these variations, right? So it looked like it was evidence of functional variability. So their final conclusion was, traditionally we try to get people to keep practicing over and over until they get a repeatable. In baseball, we talk about the repeatable delivery, the consistent bowling average, because it's long believed that's how you get consistent outcome. Again, this adds to the huge body now across a lot of different sports. That's not how you achieve consistent outcomes. You achieve them through synergies, which I talked about a couple episodes ago. You achieve them through functional variability, right? So I think this is a nice study, adds to the literature on this idea of the funnel of variability, supporting a functional variability. Where do we go from here? Where do we go next, right? A challenge with a lot of these studies, right, again, is they show this functional variability. All they can really say, right, is that it may be functional in terms of adapting to constraints. And even in things like uncontrolled manifold, when you're measuring things, we call it good variability, but technically it should be called potentially good variability, because not many studies show a link between the good variability and the constraints in the environment. So that's really where there's some studies that have shown this, but we really need to move more to showing that these variations, for example, the variations they're finding early in delivery are related to something. They're functional. They're related to the number of balls you've thrown. Maybe it's fatigue related. They're related to some other factor, right? So that's, I think, where we need to go next to kind of build on this research. You've shown this evidence of this funnel of variability and this functional variability in a lot of different sports. All the presentations I have on my website, I've talked about it in volleyball, hockey, baseball, soccer. There's a lot of evidence to support this. So I think this is kind of the next step we need to take. Okay, that's it for now. Thanks for joining me here. I just promote my all my stuff. As I mentioned, my new book's slowly finishing it off and coming soon in a few months. We're going to focus on ecological coaching. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including a monthly coaches meetup, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled. Gone through St. Louis.